welcome. You signed up for the WP REST API webinar. If you were looking for Economics 101, you're in the wrong spot. But we're here today to talk a little bit about the WordPress REST API, how it started, how it's being used, and how we can use it ourselves on our own projects. So if you downloaded the cheat sheet, you should have gotten on your email when you registered. You can have that kind of open. We're going to go through that a little bit. But yeah, we'll just jump right into it. So I'm going to share my screen here so you guys can see the slides. Cool. So if you can, in fact, infinite mirror depth there. So you should be able to see the slides here, and we will get started. Okay, so like I said, we're going to be learning a little bit about the REST API. I'm Keenan Copenhaver. You can find me at various places around the internet. These links here. Level Up WP is a Facebook page we're starting, soon to be a WordPress blog, basically sharing articles and links and stuff about WordPress that are kind of go beyond your general beginner introduction tutorials. I also do some WordPress stuff on GitHub. You can find me at the third link there. I'll be looking at some of those links today too. So basically, who am I? I'm a WordPress developer. I've worked with Dojo, a digital agency in Lakeview, Chicago, for about 3 years now. I've been almost exclusively working on WordPress during that time. Anywhere from brochure sites with a few simple pages all the way up to sites with tens and 20s of thousands of posts. So it's been a wide range, and we've had, there's challenges that go with each of those different kinds of sites. So seen a lot of that. But recently, myself and other people on the Dojo team have been using the WordPress REST API for some of our production sites. For functionality that previously we'd have to hack around another way. So we found it pretty useful for being able to just do bits and pieces, not necessarily having to do the whole thing in an API format, which is certainly possible. We'll look at that a little bit later. But even just for small bits and pieces, just to power one widget or one section of one page, or just for a certain modal and stuff like that. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today. So why are we here? We kind of went over this a little bit. But we're going to learn a little about the WordPress REST API. We're going to see some examples. We're going to learn what's exactly included when you just download WordPress core, and what you need the WordPress REST API plugin to do. And we're going to learn how to create our own endpoint. So if we need, like I was saying, if you need just one endpoint to power one modal, you can just have it return the specific data that you need. So that'll be kind of the interactive piece at the end. So if you've got questions, you can ask them anytime in the chat below. I'll kind of leave that open for now, and we'll go back to it at the end. We'll grab a couple questions if there's any in there. You can also always reach out to me via email. The emails I sent you today, you can just hit reply to one of those and just get a hold of me that way. Okay, so how did the REST API come about? It was initially proposed after the WordPress Community Summit in 2012. You may have seen his name around the internet, but Ryan McHugh is one of the big proponents of the WordPress REST API. Who's doing a lot of work on it, along with Rachel Baker. And he basically thought, okay, how do we there's APIs all around the internet. How can we kind of bring that functionality to WordPress, which powers a significant portion of the web? And what would that look like? So the first big thing that they had to consider was, should it be JSON or XML? The XML RPC API has existed in WordPress for a long time. And they kind of wanted a departure from that because in a lot of ways dealing with XML is a pain. So they decided to go with JSON just because of how most programming languages have a way to deal with it. It maps really well to how languages naturally want to consume data. And it's just kind of the way that things were going at the time. Along the same lines, they decided on the REST paradigm because it matches up very well with kind of a CMS structure. With REST architecture, you have resources. And those map very well to kind of the concept of posts or pages and stuff like that in WordPress. So it was pretty easy to kind of make that shift in thinking. So that was when it was proposed. A lot of work has been done on it since then. It was initially targeted for one of the version 3's releases of WordPress. I think it was 3.6. But it eventually, part of the infrastructure got merged into WordPress 4.4. And that was in late 2015. So that link down below there, core.track.wordpress.org, that's the actual change set where the very first version of the API that made it into core was merged into core. So I've got a lot of links on these slides. Don't worry about kind of trying to take them down or whatever. I'll send out a link to the slides after we're done here. But basically, that's where you can just see the code actually being merged in. And if you want to see more of Ryan McHugh talking about how the REST API came about, the inspiration for it, and how it kind of was modeled off of other APIs, you can check out that YouTube link. It's him giving a talk at a Day of REST over in London. So that's a little bit of the history. Let's look at some examples. So these are some examples of the REST API in the wild. We're going to go through each one here. So the first one we want to talk about is Us2. Us2 is a portfolio site that is entirely built on the WordPress REST API and using React as the front end. So you can kind of see scrolling through here, the background colors changing, stuff like that, all the fancy JavaScript flashiness that we've come to expect on the modern web. But if I go and click one of these links, for example, click the blog, the page doesn't reload. It just gives me a new page content. So it's very much like a single page app in that way. If you click on one of these blog posts, you can see that it goes to the blog, which is powered a little bit differently. But again, it's all just a React front end on top of the WordPress REST API. And that allows for a very kind of seamless experience. It doesn't feel like a traditional website. It feels like a very modern JavaScripty website, because it is. But everyone who's writing the articles and contributing to the content is still able to get the WordPress experience that they're used to without being forced into the kind of every page is a new load box that most WordPress sites, at least before the API, forced you into. So again, if you want to check this out, it's us2.com. The most interesting thing about Us2 is that they actually released all the code for their front end on GitHub. So if you go to github.com/us2, you can find the project called us2.com front end. And they go through a lot of what powers their website and why they made certain decisions. And it's really, really comprehensive. My favorite part of this whole README is kind of this architecture diagram down here, which if you look at it all at once, it's a lot. But if you kind of break it down piece by piece, you can try to understand what each piece is doing. So this box over here on the left is the backend, where they have the CMS admin and their MySQL database with Memcache in front of it. And then it's powered by the WordPress API. Up at the top here, this is how they have their images loading through a CDN. And then their front end with Nginx, and they're running a very, very basic Node.js server with React in front of it all. So again, this is super comprehensive. If you're looking to get started with a project and use the API for pretty much everything, this is a good place to look. So again, GitHub, Us2, and the us2.com front end project, and that link is in the presentation that you will get after the webinar. So that's an example of an entire site that's being powered by the WordPress REST API. What else? So WP Live Search is a prototype of a plugin. It's a super lightweight search plugin, and it utilizes the WordPress REST API. So again, it's very beta, but you can see that when as you type, it kind of gives you the type ahead content, and that's all powered by the API. Now, notice that under here under the requirements, it requires you to have the API plugin. So as we'll talk about a little bit later, that means it's using all of the endpoints that the plugin gives you. I'm assuming if you wanted to modify it, you could hook it up to your own endpoints. but just kind of out of the box, it uses all the default endpoints that require you to have the plugin. So something to think about if you're considering something like this. Just make sure that you're also able to get the plugin installed. So that's an example of a plugin that uses the REST API, just for a very small piece of it. A project that I was working on recently, kind of a front end that's not WordPress at all, is building a really basic sort of digital newspaper. So this article goes into a lot more detail, which you can look at. But basically, we had this fake newspaper called JavaScript News Daily, and you could add stories to it, and those stories would come from the WordPress REST API. And when you clicked add story, it would drop into its container, which could then be resized, and you could kind of lay out this digital paper on your screen. It was a prototype, and we haven't done a lot of work on it since, but at the top of the article, there is a link to the actual code that is on GitHub. So that's on my GitHub. Again, it kind of talks about a little bit how it's built. It's not React or anything fancy like that. It's all just jQuery. But it also has the ability, a little bit buggy, but it has the ability to export your quote unquote newspaper to a PDF when you're done. So you can kind of, you could ship it off to another layout system, or you could put it in an email or something like that. So kind of just exploring what the REST API could do at the very basic level of just powering a JavaScript front end by supplying it with article content. So you can now use WordPress with the REST API. You can use WordPress to power web apps and other things that aren't tied to WordPress at all. This was hosted on a completely separate server, and it wasn't interacting with WordPress in any way except for loading the post content through JSON. So you can power completely separate apps using the WordPress REST API, and anyone who is writing content for you, all they would need to have is just your WordPress credentials, and they would log in and post stuff through WordPress, and they wouldn't have to deal with any of that front end stuff at all. Another thing that's being explored recently and is being opened up is WordPress powered mobile apps. So this is another example. There's a bunch of examples out there. This is just another example from my GitHub. It's a really basic React Native app that, again, just pulls down JSON article content from the WordPress REST API and shows just a featured image, the excerpt, and when you click read more, it takes you to the full WordPress site. So not using everything, but just supplying article content directly to the app, not making the app load a web view or anything like that, just supplying content directly to it that can just be rendered in React Native. So you can take a look. If you don't know how React Native works, this might be a little bit of a learning curve to pick this one up, but it's pretty straightforward. It looks similar to what we did with the digital newspaper, which is basically just you have to have an API call where you load the stories into the app and then just render them out in the different views. So if you're looking to do something with React Native, this can be kind of a cool example. Still a work in progress. Infinite Scroll needs a little bit of work with this, but it's an example nonetheless. And there's many, many more. So one of the a thread on WordPress.org, basically Ryan McHugh, we talked about earlier, posted and said, well, who's using it? What are you guys doing with it? And how is it being used? He just kind of wanted to know. So some of the examples that we just saw were pulled from this thread, but some of them weren't. So and there's more examples in here than we had time to go over today. So this thread is definitely worth a look if you're kind of looking to use the API, don't really know what you want to use it for, or anything like that. You can kind of see this is what some other people are doing out in the real world. So this is the many more piece of it. Give this a look and kind of a read. There's a lot of responses here, and a lot of what people contributed saying this is what we'd really like it to do. They have since included. This thread's back from mid 2015, so they've included some of those things, which is really cool to see. So those are some examples of apps and sites using the REST API actually in production. Just to kind of give you an idea of what's possible. We won't be building anything as complex as those things today. We're just going to build a single endpoint, but it can very easily scale up to powering apps, mobile or web apps, and entire sites like we saw with us too. So definitely worth a look. So we saw the demos. So back a couple slides, we said the REST API was merged into core, and I had a little asterisk there. So is the REST API part of WordPress core? Can I just go download the latest zip of WordPress and start using the REST API? Well, yes, kind of. And that's what we're going to get into today. So the piece of the API that was merged into core was just the infrastructure. So basically all the code that allowed you to create your own endpoints and to kind of use the REST API in that way. The pre-built endpoints are not in core. So without any sort of plugin, we can create our own endpoints, and that's what we're going to be doing today. But if we want to just go to our site.com/wpjson/posts and get a list of all of our posts, if we don't want to build that endpoint for ourselves, we need to use the plugin for that. So the plugin is here at v2.wp-api.org. This is actually all the documentation for it. You can download the plugin from the wordpress.org plugin repository. But basically, you can see from just reading through the description that it gives you like these routes right here. So this is what I was just talking about, WP-JSON, WP v2 posts. So if you get request that, then you can just get a list of all your posts. So we can actually see how that works. If we go up here, this is just a basic WordPress install we've got going on. And if we activate the WordPress REST API plugin, and we make sure that we flushed our permalinks, so the endpoints are in there. And again, just 2016 running, whatever, with some post content in there. So hit WP JSON, WP v2 posts. Now you see that we're getting all of these posts are being returned. So these are all of the posts that are in the backend, and we didn't have to do any additional setup for it. So this is the kind of thing that you could point your mobile app at, or you could point your web app at, to kind of just list out all of the posts and just supply whatever content you needed for the posts. If you're following along on the cheat sheet, this is where you would also add your filters. So we have this endpoint right here. If we only wanted one post on here, just again, we can just do the filter post per page. And then if we only wanted one post, we could set it equal to 1. And hitting that, we see we just get the one post. So for the filtering and all that stuff, you'll need the plugin, unless you're going to build that logic yourself. But the plugin is very good about exposing these kind of WP query variables that you can just put as URL parameters to modify the response you're getting back. If we say post for page 10, then of course we get our 10 items back here. That's just a little look into how filters work and how plugin actually gives you a lot of those endpoints for free. So we'll deactivate that for now. So yeah, so the infrastructure for everything is built into core. You can start using it today to create your own endpoints, and that's what we've been doing a lot of in production. But if you want all the various endpoints that are kind of the more RESTful structure, where you can get posts or post to update posts and stuff like that, you need the plugin. So like we just saw, what does the plugin give us? It gives us endpoints for posts, pages, revisions, media, post types, everything listed here. So it's kind of hard to see if you're doing more than just one very specific thing. It's kind of hard to see a downside to including the plugin, because it gives you all of this stuff for free. And it allows you to expand what you're doing with the API at a later date without doing more work. So if you have a few widgets and one of them is powered by the API, and you decide, okay, down the road we want another one to be powered by the API, if you already have the plugin enabled and you're using it, you don't need to add any more endpoints or spend any more work doing that. It's just all available. You can also enable it for a custom post type or a custom taxonomy. So if you're adding custom post types to a site and you want that same kind of posts endpoint for the custom post types as well, you can pass that as a parameter when you register the post type. And the same goes for a custom taxonomy. So you can see all of that in the reference, which again is the link we showed earlier, just v2.wpapi.org/reference. this will walk you through the sample routes that you need, what parameters you need to pass to the routes and stuff like that. So always good to take a look at this, especially if you're kind of getting stuck or if you're trying to get started with using it. All right, and without the plugin, we kind of went over this a little bit, but there's no endpoints are available out of the box, but they can be created. So the 4 steps that we're going to kind of go over are: we need to create a function that's actually going to handle getting the data and returning it. We need to register the route that we want and then link that function to that route. We then need to flush the rewrite rules to make sure that our latest routes are available to WordPress. And step 4 is profit. So let's dive in. So step 1 is create a function to return the necessary data. So here we are in Sublime, and I have copied these 2 functions, pieces of code, over from the cheat sheet that you received in email. So just one thing to be careful of: when I was copying and pasting these, some of the brackets got out of line and misarranged. So just make sure if you're copy pasting that all your curly braces and parentheses are in the right spot, in the right order, and they're closing what they're supposed to be closing. So we're here, step 1, create a function to return the necessary data. So here's our function that's going to return the data we need. Right here, latest post by author. And I'm just here in the 2016 theme for our just test site here. So I'm going to grab this function and go and put it into functions.php. And just to walk through this a little bit, basically it receives a data array. We'll set up exactly how that's passed in a little bit later. But it grabs the ID from the data array, which in our case is the ID of the author that it's looking at. It runs a get posts query on that author and gets all the posts by that author. If that array is empty, so if no posts are associated with an author, it returns a WP error, and it says this page is 404. There's either no author or there's no post associated with that author. If there are posts associated with that author, it returns the post title of the first one. That's what this method will do for us. So that is it for step 1. We've created the function to return the necessary data. Step 2 is register our function with the register rest route. So if we go back and look, the second part of the code that was in the cheat sheet is right here. It's a little bit more complicated, but let's put that into functions.php as well and dissect what it's actually doing. So when the REST API initializes, it fires this REST API init event. So we want to hook into that and fire our function to set up our routes right after the REST API initializes. So we're calling our function here. We're running the function register rest route. So this takes a few parameters. The first parameter is what's called a namespace. So if we pull over here our sample URL, just to see what it looks like, all WordPress REST API endpoints are prefixed by this WP-JSON. The namespace is basically where we want our method to live. So it's what prefixes our method in the URL. So you can see my plugin v1 here. That goes in front of our actual route that we're building. The reason for this is if you make, for example, my plugin v1 and then you want to start working on version 2 of the API, you can leave all those routes in place and just start building under the my plugin v2 namespace. And then you could have routes that were called the same thing, but they would just be namespace under v2. So lots of APIs do this. It eases the transition between versions of APIs, and then when version 1 was fully deprecated, you could just remove those. So that's just a quick tour of namespacing. And then the second piece of this is actually the route that we want to call. So in our case, we're going to call /author, and then we're going to have them pass the ID in after the author. So you can see we have a regex here, and it's zeroing in on the ID. So this sets up a route that's going to look something like this. So we have to pass register rest route some additional parameters. So for one, we want this to be a get method. So you can do post methods, you can do update methods, but this is pretty simple. We're not updating any data, we're not changing any data on the server side. So we just want to run a get method. The callback is which function you want to call to actually to handle the request. So in our case, we want to call our function latest post by author. That will call our function down here that we just created. And arguments are where you pass in all of the elements that need to go in this data array that's passed to our function. So we just want to pass in one argument, the ID. So the ID is a special value in our case because we want to make sure that it's always numeric. Passing in an ID that was alphabetical characters or anything like that doesn't make a lot of sense. So we can do a validate callback, and we make that a function with the various parameters that come in. We can say, is it numeric? And if it is, it returns true and the validation passes. If it returns false, the validation does not pass and it won't even fire our method. So let's assume we have this URL here. The validation all passes. It gets the ID of 1. It passes 1 into the function. It returns the post where the author is author ID 1. And then it returns the post title to us. So now that we have that in here, we'll hit save. We'll go back over to our test installation. A really cool tool, it's a plugin that I have installed on here. It's called Rewrite Rules Inspector. And if you're doing anything with rewrites or anything with the API, it's a really cool tool to be able to see what's exactly what you're doing and what's working. So we'll click on Tools, Rewrite Rules, and we'll just say flush our rules just to make sure we have all the latest stuff. And you can see we have 2 WP-JSON routes up here, which means it looks like our custom route is going to be working. So let's try it out. So let's grab the URL we've specified for ourselves up here and put it in. And look at that, it grabs this post title. And if we go into the post in the admin, we can see that that is the latest post that author ID 1 has posted. So on this site in particular, there's only one author. So what if we pass it author ID 2? Well, then it's going to give us our no author response because that author doesn't exist. That author doesn't have any posts associated with them. And because of our validation, if we pass it a non-numeric string, the route doesn't even get matched because it says we told it that the ID needed to be numeric, and if it's not numeric, this is obviously not the route we're looking for. So if you wanted to return more than the post title, if you wanted to say return the entirely latest post that this author has written, you could just remove post title and return the entire post object. In that case, when you called author 1, it would return the entire post object, just like we saw earlier with the plugin. So this would be useful maybe if you were building a widget that you wanted to get on another post that the author wrote, get the latest post by that author and just show kind of the excerpt. If you wanted to build that as, say, a React component or some sort of JavaScript component, you could call this API method to actually populate that component with data. And it would give you the date, the content, and the title, and all of the stuff that you would need to actually populate that. In addition, if you needed different information, this is where the piece of the cheat sheet that goes into defining other fields could come in handy. So you could register a field, like in this example, to include the featured image for this post, because we can see here that this post has a very nice featured image. So if we wanted to include the URL of that in this response, we could use our code right here to add it as a field, so that in addition to all these fields like post content and post title, we would just have featured image URL, which we could then use to pull in to our widget or whatever we were building. So we registered the REST route, we flushed our permalink rules, and now that's about it. You can now profit by creating your own WordPress REST API endpoints. So this is the time when we'll do some Q&A. If you have other questions for me that we didn't cover in the webinar or you didn't get a chance to do in the Q&A, you can find me at any of these places around the internet. You can also respond to one of the emails you got from me today, or my emails on my GitHub as well. So hope you got a lot of knowledge out of this, and I'll see you around.